Confessions of a Failed Southern Lady by Florence King, Chapter 8. By the time I entered high school, my sex education resembled a bureaucratic snafu. Mama thought Granny had taken care of it, and Granny thought Mama had. In 1950, girls of 14 were divided into two groups, those who knew a little something and those who knew too much. My historical novels had taught me that women always enjoy sex, but the authors were maddeningly vague about what it was that felt so good. I wanted technical facts, not psychological states. I already knew that ecstasy covered her like the waters of a magic pool. What I did not know was what exactly happened on all the fictional wedding nights I had devoured. All I knew about wedding nights was that he snuffed out the candle, or blew out the lamp, or turned down the gas jet. These thrifty actions were usually followed by 3 dots to indicate that something else happened. No matter how nervous the bride was, she never had to go to the bathroom, just as well since there wasn't any, and as soon as the bedchamber was flooded in blackness, or bathed in darkness, she did not surface again until the next morning. These novels created an entire generation of American women who cannot have a sexual fantasy without getting bogged down in details about lights and bathrooms. Our problems started in high school, when, saturated in wedding nights but knowing nothing whatsoever about them, we discussed them anyway. Like Franz Joseph designing a new button for the Austrian hussar's uniform while the empire crumbled, we did the best we could. Who uses the bathroom first? The bride. That way she can come floating out in a white negligee while he's opening the champagne. But if she uses the bathroom first, she'll be left alone while he uses it. That doesn't seem right. Yes, but if he uses it first, he'll be undressed before she is, and that's not right either. Why would he open the champagne and then turn around and go into the bathroom? Well, they drink 1 glass together, and then he goes into the bathroom. Where are his robe and pajamas? And the ascot, don't forget the ascot. Well, they're already unpacked. He did that before he opened the champagne, so he could just pick everything up and go into the bathroom. When he comes out, he picks her up and carries her to the bed and throws her down on it. How can he turn out the light if he's holding her? She reaches out while she's in his arms and switches it off. Well, that doesn't seem right. He should do it. But then he'd have to put her down, turn out the light, and pick her up again so he can throw her on the bed. But if he turns it out before he picks her up and throws her on the bed, he might miss. He leaves 1 light on so he can see. That doesn't seem right. The information Peg had imparted to me when we were 8 was, the man gets on top of the lady and puts his thing on her thing. It was still just about all I knew. I remained unaware of erection, penetration, and ejaculation. I thought that a dangling participle was placed on a split infinitive, and that was that. While this certainly sounded like what the newspapers called intimate with, it did not explain the furor over virginity and the tragedies that awaited brides who were not intact. Men can tell, everyone said darkly. Tell what? That I had been wiping myself all these years? What caused the terrible pain suffered by Frank Yerby's heroine, Denise, in The Vixens, when she bit through her lip? I asked Granny. Your grandfather was always a perfect gentleman. Finally, I got the word Maidenhead out of her before she balked. I thought it sounded like one of those peaceful English villages in murder mysteries. Anne Hopkins came up with hymen, and Helen told us it was Greek for membrane. I knew that hymens were connected somehow with the emotional question of who could and could not use Tampax, so I sneaked the brochure out of Mama's box and read it. I had just gotten to the good part when Jency snatched it out of my hand and told me to keep myself pure for Jesus, who wanted me for a sunbeam. I locked myself in the bathroom with a hand mirror, and tried to find my hymen without ruining myself for marriage. I sort of wanted to get married, having just read Turgenev's On the Eve. I wanted to marry a Bulgarian revolutionary, if I could find one who hated children. I examined myself. I knew where I menstruated from, but since that was an area concerned with female trouble, I did not see what it could possibly have to do with men. I looked elsewhere and found the clitoris. At first I did not know it was a clitoris. I called it the bump. As I studied it, the light dawned. This was the famous maidenhead. It had to be. It was the only thing I could find that looked like a head. It was all clear now. Intercourse is when a man presses on the bump until it falls off. When that happens, you aren't a virgin anymore. There was only one thing that bothered me. What did you do with the bump after it fell off? Was there a bump fairy? A few months later, I was deflowered in the doctor's office. My menstrual cramps had been getting steadily worse since I got my first period. I had already been examined anally by Granny's doctor, who was the sweetheart of the daughters, to see if I had any of the exotic maladies that ran in our family, but he had pronounced me normal down below. I didn't feel normal. I was spending the first day of every period curled up in a knot in the high school infirmary, so Granny took me back to him. "Well, I can do a regular examination," he told her, "but I'll have to break through." Her hand fluttered to her bosom. "What will she say when she gets married?" He patted her shoulder. It was his medical specialty. "Don't worry, I'll give her a certificate of virginity. She can show it to her husband, and he'll know he didn't get damaged goods." I climbed into the stirrups, expecting a clitorodectomy. He froze the vaginal area with a local anesthetic and began snipping. I couldn't imagine what he was doing way down there in female trouble land when he was supposed to be cutting off the bump. "That's got it," he said, and inserted his finger. The second correct light dawned. He could find no reason for my cramps, so he patted my foot, told me to use a heating pad, and avoid rain. "There's one thing that really cures cramps, and that's having a baby," he said fondly. "Now you stay as sweet as you are, you hear? Here's your certificate, honey." It was terribly impressive. It began, "To whom it may concern," and bore a notary's seal from his nurse. As I read it, I pictured myself floating out of a bathroom in a white negligee, saying, "I have something for you to read." I handed it to Granny, who sighed raggedly and put it in her purse. When we got home, she showed it to Mama. "He should have put, 'Now hear this.' Then she could show it to the whole goddamn Navy." "Oh, Louise!" Usually, Mama was profane rather than baldy. While she would say anything to shock Granny, in her own way she was sexually restrained. I think the reason she never talked to me about sex was that she felt girl talk was sissy. This probably explains the unique turn her one sex lecture took. It happened at the sink while we were washing dishes. Suddenly, out of the blue, she said, "If a man ever asks you to do something funny to him, you tell him to go to hell, you hear?" "What do you mean?" "Never mind, just promise me." Mystified, I promised. We washed a few more dishes, then she spoke again. "That's why the French can't win a war without our help. It saps their strength. They spend all their time doing something funny to each other, and then we have to go over there and pull their chestnuts out of the fire." Before I could frame any more questions, she threw down the dishcloth with a splat and stalked out of the kitchen, singing "Over There" at the top of her lungs. The awkward age lasted through my first year in high school, but in the second year my fat fell away, and I became pleasing to passing strangers again. Soldiers downtown kept asking me for directions to the White House. I did not date in high school. I was not forbidden to. Like the books I read, it was my choice, and I chose not to. My reasons were mixed. The simplest one had to do with the custom of neighborhood schools prevalent at this time. Many of the boys in high school had been my classmates ever since kindergarten. We had thrown up together, farted together, wet our pants together, picked our noses together for so many years that we looked on each other with the dull eyes of the long married. The rezoning that grew out of the Powell and Central transfers had thrown a lot of new boys into my life, but pride kept me from dating them. They had seen me in the first year of high school, when I was still in the awkward age, and it gave them an advantage I did not want them to have. My biggest reason for not dating was the old one of peer problems. I had physical desires and enormous curiosity about sex. I wanted to neck and pet, but I did not want to play knock-knock jokes at marshmallow roasts or sing endless choruses of Goodnight Irene on hay rides. I wanted to dispense with the social aspect of dating and get down to brass tacks. But it was impossible. You couldn't meet a boy one moment and get your tongue sucked the next. You had to go out with him. Not just once either, but several times. I did not see why I had to sit through movies I could just as well see alone, and then adjourn to the hot shops, when I could just as well feed myself, all in order to get what I wanted, which was the same thing the boys wanted. But there was no way out of this conundrum if one wanted to remain a nice girl, and at this point I still did. I would not have minded being a bad girl in my own mind, and I certainly had no fear of going to hell. I shared Herb's belief in reincarnation, and couldn't wait to see what I was going to be next. What I did mind was the idea of not being treated right by boys. A girl who went too far was considered fair game. Once the boys found out about her, they became what Ann Hopkins called fierce. Fierce boys wrote a dirty girl's name and phone number on the bathroom wall. She got a lot of phone calls, but no specific invitations, just, "You want to go out with me?" This euphemism was always accompanied by sounds of snickering in the background as the caller's friends gathered round the phone and listened in. Granny's songs had accustomed me to the idea of righteous wrath. Her lyrical heroines were a touchy lot, ever ready to snap, "Take back your gold," or "My mother was a lady." These ostensibly pathetic Nells and Marys wrote the book on assertiveness. They thought nothing of standing outside saloons and singing about empty larders and consumptive babies until father gave up and came home. And they never hesitated to interrupt a wedding in progress to lay a fatherless child in the arms of a mortified bridegroom. They caused uproars wherever they went. Trains, hansom cabs, and sweatshops were constantly subjected to indignant cries of, "Have you a sister, sir?" Even mansions of aching hearts knew no peace. How gay 90s whores ever made any money was a mystery. As soon as the customers arrived, the madam started giving them hell for being the cause of it all, until they broke down and started sobbing about Indiana. Having been nourished on this musical diet, the idea of being treated as anything less than a queen made me furious. So my sex life took place exclusively in my mind. I fantasized about a room where I could go with a fallen boy. It would contain a couch where we would do the things I wanted to do, and when I was finished, I would turn his picture to the wall and forget about him until the next time. Being easily shamed like all fallen boys, he would permit himself to be forgotten. He would not give me knowing leers when he passed me in the hall, or tell the other fallen boys that I had taken liberties with him. He would be exactly like a genie in a bottle. I would rub the bottle to make him appear, and then he would rub me. I became known as the girl who doesn't date. Ironically, it won me my first real popularity. "God, you must have strict parents," Ann Hopkins said in heartfelt tones. The other girls at the lunchroom table nodded and breathed, "Yeah, God." Everyone was gazing at me with deep sympathy and understanding, obviously thinking that I wasn't so bad after all. They reminded me of Greer Garson in Blossoms in the Dusk, ready to stand up and cry, "There are no peer problem children, just peer problem parents." It would have been so easy to keep my mouth shut and let them think what they already thought, but somehow I could not do it. "No," I blurted, "my parents aren't a bit strict. They'd let me date if I wanted to, but I don't want to." The sympathy and understanding vanished. Under ordinary conditions, they would have persecuted me in that subtle way of females. A few of them tried, but it never amounted to more than a giggle behind a hand when I passed. They were intimidated by the cachet I now had. At long last I belonged to a select in-group, democracy's version of 16 Porterlings and a unicorn ghouls. I was college-bound. The term had different meanings depending upon one's sex. College-bound boys associated freely with their non-academic confreres and looked up to them as avatars of badass masculinity. Cars, sports, and gang showers created a male society that was by and large classless, but no such equality existed among the girls. For us, academic status bestowed an almost unbridgeable social status as well. Some girls were more equal than others, and I was a some. It was the same kind of unavoidable elitism that had plagued the suffragettes and would plague the feminists of the 70s. There is no such thing as a fallen woman. When she steps out of her place, she always steps up. Our group was called the Brains. It consisted of all the Jewish girls, all the Chinese girls, all the diplomatic corps girls, some of the Greek girls, and a tiny minority of straight-A Southern wasps. Our motivations were as different as we were. The Jewish girls had a tradition that exalted book learning. The diplomatic girls were the daughters of a foreign intelligentsia who took taking a degree for granted. Rani Dasgupta was a Brahmin. And the ethnic girls came from families who cherished the American dream. Southern wasps stood outside this charmed circle. Our families looked down on the American dream, muttered about old maids and blue stockings, and were only slightly closer to the intelligentsia than the Jukes and the Kallikaks. Our compensatory advantages were that quality of personality that comes to fullest flower in a Protestant whose mind is made up. Here I stand, I can do no other, and one sane relative who supported us against the rest. Mary Jane Magruder, that's an old Maryland name, had a Brooklyn-born aunt who silenced the impassioned wails of, "You think you're better'n us," with, "Shut up, you hicks." I had Herb. If any of us had heard the word feminist, we would have thought it meant a girl who wore too much makeup. But we were, without knowing it, feminists ourselves, bound together by the free masonry that exists among intelligent women who know they are intelligent. It is the only kind of female bonding that works, which is why most men do not like intelligent women. They don't mind one female brain if they can enjoy it privately. It's the idea of two or more on the loose that upsets them. The girls in the college-bound group might not have been friends in every case. Sharon Cohen and I gave each other the willies, but our instincts told us that we had the same enemies. The non-academic girls, a much larger and much more homogeneous group, did not have a name. This struck me as odd, so I told Herb about them and asked him to think of something to call them. He came up with Malkin, a Shakespearean word meaning a woman of the lower orders. I felt it was too strong. A few of the girls in this group were trashy, and some were common. Never mind the difference, it would take another whole book to explain that. But the rest were neither. I had lost Peg to this group, but I knew she wasn't trashy or common. Nor, I had to admit, was Ann Hopkins. Certainly they were not all stupid, Quite a few of them had been tracked to 7A3 with me, so we must have had about the same IQ. Therefore, it was something else that made a girl a Malkin. Anne was their undisputed leader, so I used her to construct a profile. First, there was the purple ink. Next, the circled I dot. Third, whenever someone asked a Malkin what she was going to be, she always answered with her steady boyfriend's name, Mrs. John J. Smith. She spent her study hall scrawling Mrs. John J. Smith over and over in her notebook. Malkins did the most dating, but they were also the most puritanical, seeming compelled to explain their dates with, "I just like to have a good time," as if denying all interest in necking and petting. Yet they were obsessed with going steady, and if a boy did not suggest it after a certain number of dates, they accused him of wasting a girl's time. Malkins cared more for appearance than appearances, arriving at school with their hair in pin curls, under kerchiefs, and going immediately to the restroom to comb it out. They all seemed to have a Rapunzel complex. Not only was their hair much longer than ours, but presumably much cleaner, because they were always saying, "I've got to wash my hair." They continued their grooming operations in homeroom, picking and pulling at themselves and each other like baboons. Anne used her eyelash curler while all heads were bowed for the Lord's Prayer, and thrust her hand inside her blouse to dab perfume on her breasts during the pledge to the flag. Malkins were always having intense feuds, and leaned heavily on the verb to cuss out when they related details of their confrontations. "I really cussed her out," they would say. Yet their cussing never exceeded damn, and they invariably mouthed shit or said shh, substituting raised eyebrows for the second syllable. It paled beside Mamma's mule-skinner glories. It occurred to me that Mamma, academically anyhow, would have essayed out to Malkin in her school days, yet I knew she wasn't one. What was it, then, that made the difference? I consulted Herb again. "Malkins leave nothing to chance, but your mother leaves no stone unturned." When I frowned in confusion, he began one of his Socratic dialogues. "Would a Malkin have stolen Charlie's lamb?" "Oh, no," I said promptly. "Why not?" "They'd be afraid of getting in trouble or being talked about." I paused, reviewing everything I knew about Anne Hopkins. "They'd be afraid of not being like everybody else." "So the key word is?" "Afraid." He nodded. "That's why your mother is a gentlewoman." I took 3 more years of French in high school. In 3rd year, we read that unsurpassed satire on machismo, Tartarin de Tarascon by Alphonse Daudet. Next came Le Livre de mon ami by Anatole France, which brought me up against the realities of translation. We had to do the Imagine et ma fille passage from the chapter Marcelle aux Yeux in a literary rather than a literal rendering. That is, we could not say, "Oh, my genius and my fairy." The narrator is an adult man recalling his boyhood crush on his mother's beautiful friend, so I settled on graceful self. 4th year was taken up with a line-by-line study of Cyrano. I found the story ridiculous, but the speeches rang like deep, resonant bells, and the title role seemed made for Mamma. It would have been just like her to call somebody a jackass and get into a sword fight. 5th year was the happiest interlude of my life. I might have been attending an expensive private academy instead of a public school. There were only 8 of us in the class, the minimum for forming a class, and all of us were girls. We began each class with a pep rally. "Mademoiselle, levez-vous," the teacher would say, and we would rise and sing La Marcelle. It gave me a delicious frisson. Even francophobic Mamma liked it. I'll say one thing for them, they've got a good Star-Spangled Banner. As we sang, we raised our eyes to the steel engraving of bare-breasted Marianne hoisting the tricolor and walking over dead bodies as she urged her male comrades to the fray. We made a strange sight, 8 little honor students all in a row, singing lustily of bloody standards and cutthroats. We did not know it, and there was no name for it in 1953, but we were into consciousness-raising. In the 5th year, we read the verse plays of Jean Racine. For once, I was studying something that stirred Granny's interest. When I told her about Phaedra's tirades, she pricked up and asked, "Is she having the change?" My favorite Racine play was Bérénice, based on a true story, whose plot turns on a situation that was dear to Herb's heart. When I translated Titus's refusal to abdicate and become "Un indigne empereur, sans impère, sans corps, vil spectateur au humain des faiblesses d'amour," or something like that, into a disgraced emperor, without an empire, without a court, a vile example of love's weakness in the eyes of all mankind, he said. Sounds like that bloody Duke of Windsor. The messy passions of Phaedra reminded me of the humid summer, but Bérénice was crisp autumn, full of the clean, cool air of passion renounced and dignity preserved. I loved autumn because it symbolized school, but I did not love passion, I merely had it. I did not even like it because I did not really like boys, I merely needed them. Once exposed to the neoclassical restraints of Bérénice, I began to resent males for their power to distract me from the life of the mind I craved. Bérénice replaced Dominique Fresson as my ideal role model. Henry Adams' theory was now my yardstick for measuring all women, but when I tried to fit Bérénice into it, she eluded definition as either Virgin or Venus. The Virgin was not yet generally known or revered in AD 70 when the events of the play took place, but Venus was everywhere in the Roman-dominated world Bérénice inhabited. She should have drawn her strong sense of identity from the goddess of love, but it was obvious she did not. She was a surprisingly masculine woman who put duty before love. Queen of Palestine in her own right, she was able to understand the political reasons why Titus, being emperor of Rome, could not marry her, instead of collapsing and having to be carried to the infirmary like Anne Hopkins when her boyfriend asked for his ring back. Bérénice walked off stage with dry eyes and full honors. I was thrilled by her exit lines. Je vivrai, je survivrai, vos ordres absolus. Adieu, Seigneur. Regnez. Je ne vous verrai plus. What's that mean? Asked Mamma. I will follow your wishes to the letter, but I will survive. Farewell, my lord. Keep your crown. I will never see you again. Good for her. She should have shot the son of a bitch. Oh, Louise, I think it would make a nice and sad movie. With Barbara Stanwyck. She goes away real good. Herb put his head in his hands. My French teacher recommended that I become a translator. You'd work for a book publisher, or several of them, she explained. When they bought the American rights to a French book, they'd pay you to translate it. You could work at home at your own pace. The idea appealed to me, and I made it my ambition. I would be like the lady named Constance Garnett, whose name appeared on all the Russian novels. Herb was full of enthusiasm for my plans. Once, when I kept fiddling with the sentence because it just doesn't sound right, his eyes lit with empathy. You have an ear for music gone awry, he said, smiling. Now that I had a clear picture of my future, my tepid interest in marriage faded. I would be a career woman and have affairs like George Sand. This decision brought me up against a double-barreled problem. I wanted no babies growing out of these future affairs, and I was tired of losing valuable study time because of menstrual cramps. Since both problems could be solved with a sweep of the surgeon's knife, I decided I wanted a hysterectomy. Knowing better than to broach the subject to our family expert, I looked around for a woman of detached scientific bent to consult. The school nurse was a Yankee, so I assumed she was free of womb lust. I was wrong. "You want to have an operation," she gasped, eyes popping. But, but that's against the law. A young girl like you. No doctor would ever. Where did you get such an idea?" My heart sank, as it always would whenever I put my faith in a woman and she turned out to be a Malkin. But it was too late now. I was already up Mamma's favorite creek without a paddle, and there was no turning back. I plunged on with as much calm assurance as I could muster. "I want to be a career woman. My periods interfere with my work." "But you wouldn't even be you without with the part you want removed. That's the part that makes you a woman." Her hand fluttered to her breast, a gesture I knew well. Without that part of yourself, you'd be nothing but an empty shell." She put a suitably hollow ring in her voice. "Why?" "Because an operation would mean that you could never have children." "I don't want any." She looked as if she'd been stabbed. She did some lip-licking, then pulled herself together and gave me that confident, puckish smile people use when they are getting ready to utter a cliché. "You'll change your mind when you have some," she said softly. "When you hold your first baby in your arms, you'll know." Suddenly she tilted her head to one side like an inquisitive terrier and winked. "Now don't let me hear any more of this silly talk. Remember," she added, sobering suddenly, "when a woman has an operation, hair grows on her chin. You don't want a beard, do you?" "No, ma'am. Those who study Greek must take pains with their dress." She frowned. "I thought you were the one who was so good at French." As good as my school was academically, its guidance counseling was almost non-existent. Most counselors at this time were teachers who had caved in, unable to cope with the rigors of classroom life. They sat out their pensions in the guidance office. Actually, there was very little for them to do. Most of the students in the school were the first members of our families to go to college. We and our parents believed that a college was a college, one was as good as the other, and a degree was a degree. As long as we went to some college, we felt we would have a passport to what was then called the good life, and would earn, as Mr. Christopoulos said to Helen, $1 million a year. Everyone was so firmly convinced of this that we had no need of guidance counselors, nor would we have listened if a good counselor had told us otherwise. Familiar with these lower middle-class attitudes, the counselors, such as they were, made life easy for themselves and let us think what we wished. It was a conspiracy between battle fatigue and ignorance. I knew about Ivy League schools, but I thought their superiority lay in social rather than academic areas. I didn't care about going to the right school. I just wanted to go on studying French. Thus, when I won a 4-year scholarship to a Washington college, it seemed to be a perfect solution to my academic aspirations and my family's limited finances. I could live at home and there would be nothing to pay for except textbooks. It sounded so good that I did not even bother to apply for any other scholarships, but took the first one I was offered. Thank you for listening.